Okay, so now that's going. Um, so nice to all be together. If you haven't used Zoom before, or if you weren't with us last time, then I'll invite you right now to take a look in the bottom left-hand corner of your Zoom window. You'll see a little microphone icon there that says mute, unmute. That's how you can keep yourself muted throughout the meeting. We'll ask that unless you're actively speaking, sharing, asking a question, that you keep yourself muted on account of the fact that the Zoom platform really doesn't allow for more than one person to be speaking at a time. And when multiple people try to speak, it creates a lot of background noise. So please, if you can, keep yourself muted unless you're actively participating. And again, the mute button and the unmute button equally is in the bottom left-hand corner of your window. Okay, if you have any technical questions, please feel free to direct them to me so that we can let Rabbi Miller and Rabbi Mitelman, who are our teachers tonight, focus on the much more important work, which is teaching Torah. I see that Rabbi Miller is just grabbing her materials, so let me bring her video up and say, for those who haven't had the chance yet to learn with Rabbi Bethie Miller, you're in for a real treat tonight. She's the co-teacher in my section of the Melton curriculum. She teaches the rhythms curriculum. She's an old friend. We went to rabbinical school together. She ordained a few years before me. I've always really looked up to her, and I'm really glad that she's a part of our Melton faculty. So with that, I'm going to make myself disappear and let Rabbi Miller do her thing.
Thank you, Rabbi Reeser. Thanks for setting this all up. I wish we were in the library like normal, but this is an amazing alternative, an amazing way to be together, and a special way for more of us to study together. So it's nice to see some familiar Tuesday night faces, and also see some new faces. And we'll figure this all out together for the next hour and learn some things about Seder while we're at it. As Rabbi Reeser said, I'm a rabbi in the community. For those who don't know me, I live in Larchmont. And this year I started a new project called Sanctuary, which brings Jewish life into people's homes and out into the community. So right now, the into our own homes is a big part of what I'm focusing on. So tonight we're going to talk about the Passover Seder, which is very, very timely. And know for the outset, my goal for all of us tonight is to have the space to think about, oh wait, what's Seder going to look like this year? How is it going to feel? And what's some Jewish wisdom that could guide me in this as I make decisions about how to adapt, how to do something different. So what I would love to do is start, and I think I want to use the chat box for this, because one thing I love about Zoom is that we can all talk over each other at the same time by writing in the chat box. And I would love people to share with the whole group something that you love about the Passover Seder, and bonus points if you say why. I can share, I love so many things about the Passover Seder. It's hard to know where to start. But I find it especially powerful that it really, it lines up with the arrival of spring, and the sense of buds in the air and the days lasting longer. And for me, that's like where the physical experience of liberation often begins. It really starts from the inside out. And so that for me is one of the things I love about Passover. And I would love for just brave souls to write something in the chat box. It's a way to hear from a lot of people all at once. And if you can't think of one thing you love, I also invite you to share a question maybe you've always had about Passover, or one that you especially have this year. And I'll start reading some. Bringing the family together on a happy occasion, having my family around the Seder table where we tell the same story and sing the songs and eat great food. The food. It seems that every year we can relate differently to the Exodus story. Lamb and laughing. Mark Rosenblatt, I like your alliteration. Family being together, passing down our traditions. The 4 questions. An occasion to gather family, always a great thing. Getting cousins together, the power of family and traditions. Amazing. Since we tend to have the same family members, it's nice to see children growing up and being able to do more each year, sharing with the little ones. You're getting to the essence, remembering being a child at the Seder and then watching your children grow up at the Seder. Fran wrote, love that one is with family and the other is with friends. There is real benefit to having this tradition of having multiple Seders. It makes it easier to be with more people. This is great. And does anyone have questions? Something that always confused them about the Seder, or something this year maybe you're feeling unsure about, wondering about. No questions? Right. So what's coming up, right? Sad not to be with everyone actually together. What if I have to do a Seder by myself? Yeah. So what people are writing, as I'm sure you can see, is we went from a highlight of Passover is being all together around the table, um, to now this, right? Like, how's it going to feel to do a Seder by myself, or have 2 people, or not have all the people? Um, so I have 2 little kids. I have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old. And my 5-year-old was in the bath and we were talking, and she knows that Passover is coming up. And then she said, so are we not going to be able to do the Passover Seder with the family? And I said, it's looking like it's going to be the 4 of us. And she burst into tears saying it's not going to be the same. I only like it because we're all together and it won't be as fun. I want to be with my cousins and my grandparents. And there was a little teeny part of me that was like, oh, wow, she really likes this. Like, that's kind of amazing at 5 years old. And so clearly, right, the power of being all together and those things that you do together every year and laugh about at the same point. And so, right, who someone wrote, Manish Tanab, why is the Seder different than every other Seder? And so this year, how do we honor the traditions and also honor that, like, right, the Seder is going to be different than other Seders? And is there a way to lean into that? Is there a way, right, if you're going to do a virtual Seder, maybe then you can be with more people than you normally would because you can be all together. Is there a way to mix it up? Because maybe there's no way to get everyone the same Haggadah. So maybe you're going to use something new this year. I'm going to take a minute because I want to make sure I didn't miss any. Big question. Zoom Seder. Thinking more deeply about our theme and what to pass down to our children. Meaningful time without actually being together. How does one do a Seder through Zoom? We depend heavily on the Haggadah. I know some people create their own. Would love to know how to do that. Right. So what we're going to talk more about tonight is in our question for night, right? So if Seder has to be different this year, what do we focus on, right? Like, what do we prioritize? How do we cultivate that sense of being all together, having different generations, passing on traditions, even though it's going to look a little bit different. And I think that going back to the original sources, to see a little bit more clearly how this tradition evolved until, to what we got last year and the year before and this year, I think is going to really empower and comfort all of us. Sound good? One of the Zoom technologies I like to do is a thumbs up, because we can see that and it doesn't require any typing. Awesome. So I'm going to share my screen, at least for the first text. It's always still a little magical when I can share my screen, and it doesn't seem to be there. Hold on one second. You guys seem very quiet, but I know it's because you're on mute. There it is. Okay, give me a thumbs up if you can see the handout. Beautiful. Okay. So again, our key question is, if the Seder needs to be different this year, right? It has to be. What should we focus on? And so we're going to start at the very beginning, and you don't have to find the page on your Torah text tonight. I have it here, right here. And I see Bob and Jane Klein. I'm going to unmute you. Will one of you be willing to read this Exodus text?
Sure.
Hi, Bob and Jane.
Yeah, go. We're unmuted.
Throughout the 7 days, unleavened bread shall be eaten. No leavened bread shall be found with you, and no leaven shall be found in all your territory. And you shall explain to your son on that day, it is because of what the Eternal One did for me when I went free from Egypt.
Great. So this comes from Exodus 13. I gather that last week you focused a lot on matzah and the Passover story. And what's also amazing about Seder and the Passover story is that we get all this instruction in the Torah before the Israelis even leave Egypt about how we're going to remember what's about to happen. And this is part of that section. And a key word gets introduced in the second verse. It's what Jane read as, and you shall explain to your son that day, or your child that day. And this is where I want you to listen really carefully. I'm going to read the Hebrew, and tell me if you hear a familiar Passover word. It's related, so it's not going to be exact, all right? But the verse begins, V'higadata levincha bayom hahu. Anyone? V'higadata? Raise your hand, write in the chat box. So V'higadata means you shall explain. Ooh, someone raised their hand. I have to figure out how to. Haggadah. Awesome. Haggadah is from this word higadata, to tell, to explain. Teach would be a stretch, but this is where it all begins. This is where the Seder tradition begins. The instruction, it's all about the matzah, no leavening, and then the next piece on that day, on that first night when the Passover festival begins, and you shall explain. And right there to the children, right? That's going to be this intergenerational explanation. And from that one word, the Passover Seder is going to emerge. So how do we explain? And how does this happen? But it starts there. So I think when we're thinking about our Seders this year, and where do we start? How do we start with Higadata? How do we begin with explanation? Is there a way we want to honor at the beginning of the Seder, right? Why is the Seder different than all other Seders? What do we want to explain? What do we want to explain to children? What do we not want to fully explain? What do we want to wait for children to ask? But I think leaning in and starting with this, okay, this is a night for explanation, for telling, for sharing stories of what happened in the past, is crucial. You with me? Can't see enough of you right now. Okay. And in this one verse, we have Higadata, and then what gets explained, at least in this first example, it's because of what the Eternal One did for me when I went free from Egypt. So this is where I would love either people to raise their hand or write in the chat box, okay? Okay, cool. I see you guys wrote Haggadah. How do you understand this line, right? So this is the night that we're supposed to explain to our children, it's because of what the Eternal One did for me when I went free from Egypt. Nancy has a question. Why does it have to be about telling children? I understand the door by door, but this year it might be a more adult conversation. So, right, so that's a great question. And I think here, actually looking at the rest of the verse is helpful, right? So the speaker is saying, it's because of what the Eternal One did for me when I went free from Egypt. So how do you understand that? Or what's confusing about that?
Are we allowed to talk?
Please.
I mean, it's confusing because the Eternal didn't do anything for me because I wasn't a slave in Egypt, but I guess it's like the royal me, like the royal we. It's the royal me that we're supposed to be immersed in the same experience that they had when they escaped from Egypt.
Right. It's this amazing and confounding line, because if you read it first in context, this instruction is being given to the generation that's leaving, right? And so they're anticipating what to do a year from now. You're going to remind your child what it was like to be freed, you personally, right? Because maybe they were there too, but they weren't paying attention. They were, right? They were complaining or asking for snacks or had their head down on the ground, right? But as you're recalling the personal experience. And then what our tradition has done is held on to this, right? This first person narrative. We're not supposed to tell the story just of our ancestors, but we're supposed to tell to the children, it's because of what the Eternal One did for me, right? And so we're obligated, it says this in the Haggadah in slightly different language, we're all obligated to see ourselves as if we are leaving Egypt. And I think here, and someone asked about children. So if they're, in the original scenario, it's a parent recalling to a child, right? How do we understand this now, right? Some of us have children, some of us have small children, some of us have adult children. But I think that's just the metaphor, right? It's about sharing the experience that maybe you recalled more clearly, you felt more strongly, the story that you have a story to share, or that everyone should share this to a son, to someone who doesn't know their story. So I think Nancy asked a question raised all about telling children. I think actually maybe we get hung up on that a little bit. And it's more about sharing with maybe someone who had a different experience, a different perspective, right? And we retell it every year, and the story stays the same, but we've changed, right? How it feels to go free from Egypt each year feels a little bit different. I want to make sure I'm not missing anyone's writing. And so I would say here, the way it gets personalized, the way we say it in the royal we or the personal I, is a both challenging and a beautiful invitation of Passover. It's not a story that we're telling and we're not sure whether it's historically accurate or not, right? I'm thinking back about the last time we met, it was about Purim. This is something we're supposed to experience for ourselves every spring. And then when it comes to the Seder, what are the props? What are the tools? What are the elements that can help us experience that more? And I know I was on a call with colleagues just yesterday feeling the struggle of like, well, how do you prepare for Passover this year? How do you prepare for liberation? Like, I feel so far from that. And part of it is like, well, let the ritual do its work on you, because we've got some amazing elements in the Seder ritual. I'd love someone to, if you'd be willing to volunteer to read. First we're going to go to text 2. Sorry, I confused myself with my handout. Sorry about that. We're now going to actually open our rhythms book. You have it. And we're going to look at the second text from the Pesach Haggadah related to this theme. When I get the page, I will tell it to you, but all of a sudden we've jumped to late in the book, lesson 26. Text 2. Anyone feel like reading? I'd love to hear your voice. Otherwise, I'm going to look for a familiar face.
I'll go ahead and read.
Great.
Okay. In every generation, one is obligated to see oneself as having personally gone out from Egypt, as it says, and you will speak to your child on that day, saying, for this did God do unto me when he took me out of Egypt. It was not only our ancestors that the Holy One, blessed be he, redeemed from Egypt, but we too were redeemed along with them.
Great. So you see how the Haggadah text is responding, amplifying that first line in Torah, bringing us all into it. And then Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg gives this wonderful explanation of like, okay, well, that sounds lovely, but how do we do that? How do we feel that? And let's read that right in coordination. I saw Andy Frankel. Andy, would you read?
Okay.
Thank you. It's right on the handout on my screen.
Yep. Rabbi Irving Greenberg wrote, Passover is the ultimate attempt to involve people in the experience of Exodus. On the yearly anniversary of its occurrence, the entire Exodus from slavery to freedom is recreated in song, story, food, and dress, so that it is experienced as an actual happening. Although some models for reenactment are found in the Bible, it is left to every generation and every family to create the total experience. Every day, homey aspects of life, food, table setting, cooking, dress, conversation, singing, are shaped and fused to create a transcendental reality.
Great. Right. So he's helping connect the dots that, we don't just have to figure that out within. How does it feel that we too are redeemed? Right. We don't have, it's not just inner work. How do we use the ritual to help us feel that way? And I guess I would be so curious, I can give some examples, but I would love to hear from others, like, are there aspects of the rituals, whether it's the food, whether it's the way you do the table, that really help kind of make it feel more personal, make it feel more alive? I saw a couple of hands raised. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a minute because I think it'll make it easier. Raised hands. Sorry, this is a feature I don't know as well. Oh, Mark, I saw you raised your hand.
It's actually Mark's wife, Sarah.
Oh, better. Oh, I see. And Sarah Stern, you're the same. I thought you were both raising your hands. Great. Okay, thanks, Sarah.
We're not sophisticated enough to know how to both raise our hands, but I want to go back to what you asked when you said, when you were talking to colleagues yesterday about how to make this meaningful. And I find that this may be the most meaningful one that we've ever experienced. If you think about, there are locusts in Africa and the Mideast, and we are experiencing a plague, and we're experiencing hardship as a people, as a nation, etc., in a way that most of us probably have never experienced it. I think the fact that we're remote from some of our loved ones, etc., only adds to making the story more potent.
Yeah. No, I'm definitely with you. I wrote up something yesterday. The image of every household in their home the night before leaving, right? Having that lamb meal and dashing the blood on their doorposts and praying for protection. I can't get that image out of my head. We also have a red front door that we haven't used now for a couple of weeks because we're only going in the backyard. So they're definitely, the images feel more resonant maybe than in years past. There also can be some tricky comparisons that I just want to put out there, right? In our Exodus narrative, right? The plagues are brought by God. I don't think God is intervening in history personally. I don't believe, to bring this virus, right? So I think we should make connections that feel right, and also know that not all the parallels are as strong as others. So I'm going to return to my other question. Thank you, Sarah, for that. Of like, what works in the Seder for you? Is it the crunchy matzah in your mouth? Is it the bitterness? Is it, I know there's some families that forget the table but sit on the floor as if they're in a tent in the wilderness. I see a hand up. Ira.
Hi. It strikes me, that in a lot of ways, what we do as Reform Jews is take lessons from history that are largely religious and archaic even, and try to figure out ways to create meaning in our modern, secular, much more, less religious and more secular lives, and find meaning in it. And, I agree with the comment before that this is an experience that really can put that into real focus, because what I think we get a lot of the time when we do our Seders that means a lot to us is figuring out how those stories can have meaning for our children or for ourselves in the world that we live in today. And I agree. I think that what we're going through here is, as much as a joke, is a plague. There's some obvious, sort of overlays between history and what's really happening. And I think that if we do this well, this could be one of the more memorable Seder experiences that we ever have, whether it's by Zoom or whether it's, through telephone calls. I hope that everybody here has used some of these videos to have really exceptional moments with friends and family. I know we have, whether it's just, gathering with a bunch of 80-year-olds who don't know how to use it and laughing as everybody tries to talk over themselves, but getting together with people who are, and no offense to the 80-year-olds if there are any on the call, but there's a real opportunity, I think, to take an experience that none of us are really enjoying, none of us wanted, and find a way to create something positive out of it through our traditions.
Right. What does it mean to use the power we have, even in the situation that we can't control, right? What does it mean to not have to work so hard to connect to the story. What does it mean to overcome the challenges and find new ways of connection? Russell wrote, I'd like to speak about the meaning of Egypt. Like, Russell, do you have something to share, or you want to ask about where Egypt is in the current narrative?
I'd like to make a comment.
Great.
Yeah. I mean, you had asked about the meaning of the Seder and of the Haggadah in our lives. I'm going to be the curmudgeon on the phone to say I hate the Haggadah. I can't stand the childishness of it. I can't stand the numerology. Everything is about how many fingers of God did this. The use of the number 7. I've always regarded numerology as the gateway to superstition. But what has made this experience meaningful to me was a talk that Rick Jacobs gave many years ago, in which he pointed out the meaning of the word Egypt in Hebrew, Mitzrayim, which he pointed out first means the narrow place, which is quite fantastic. I mean, literally, Egypt is a narrow place. It was the strip of fertile land on either side of the Nile. And he also pointed out that it's a plural noun, which of course made sense at the time, because as we know historically, there were 2 kingdoms of Egypt. There was the kingdom of Upper Egypt and the kingdom of Lower Egypt. But what I thought was so wonderful about that explanation is that there are many Egypts. All of us have an Egypt in our life. Whatever is narrow in our life, whatever confines us, is Egypt. I'm troubled by the analogy of our current coronavirus to the plagues, because if that's the case, I think we're the Egyptians this time in this story, and not necessarily those who are liberated. But to me, it is not the literal story or as I say, what I consider to be the infantile recounting of it in the Haggadah that is meaningful. But if we search for what is Egypt in our lives, what is narrow in our lives, in our thinking, in our relationships, in our professional life, and if this is an invitation to devote the rest of our year to overcoming that narrowness, to effectively liberating ourselves, then that does, for me, more work than the Haggadah does.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, figuring out where our Egypt is and where we need to find spaciousness and expansion and freedom is a really important place to start. That's great. And I think, you gave a great example of why we don't, if a traditional Haggadah isn't serving us, all the more reason to, get to the essence. What are the key parts of the Seder, and what do I want to build on? And you just modeled beautifully what does it mean to explain? What needs to be explained? What needs to be felt personally? And all ritual should lead us to action. And if you need to spend all night talking about how you get there, that's why there's food there and wine. So thank you for that.
Can I argue with Russell a little bit?
I wish you would.
Beautiful.
I've also argued with Rick about this. I understand that there are reasons to free ourselves from our inner bonds, etc. But I think that this particular night and this particular Haggadah is to remind us of a particular event, and that is the story of the Jews. It's our origin story, and we should not forget it. And we need to be reminded of it, and we also need to be reminded that they're bad guys in the world. And if we forget they're bad guys in the world, then we get in trouble. And we can't always defend ourselves or escape from those bad guys, but in every generation, et cetera, et cetera. And I would also, Russell, I don't really understand. You're saying we're the Egyptians in this story. I don't know who the Egyptians are in this story. I do know, and this is a discussion for a different venue, that the Chinese are not the good guys.
Well, in the first place, obviously, I appreciate your perspective. I don't think what we're saying is all that different, because yes, we can certainly be reminded there are bad guys in this world. The reason why I say we're the Egyptians is that I think we're the victims of this particular plague. We're not being
I see.
necessarily being liberated by it. But going back to the initial thing, I guess it all depends on what it means to be reminded of this story. To me, all of the Torah is the story of liberation of the mind. If I recall correctly, not long after the liberation, as our ancestors were lost in the desert, they faced certain challenges, and everyone starts saying, we were better off in Egypt. You know, let's go back to Egypt. And that is a perfect example of enslaved thinking. There were other alternatives. They could have built a boat. You know, they could have taken a different route. But the idea of saying, let's go back to Egypt, is an example of how we as a people are always tempted to think like slaves. And if we use this liberation story as the story of how we're invited to pick up on our own 2 feet, that a miraculous event occurred, and miraculous events do occur in our lives, and I hope another one is in the offing, because we certainly could use it right now. But whatever it is, it's up to us to find our own feet, our own minds, our own voice. All of us are victim of that let's go back, as opposed to let's go forward way of thinking. And whether it's a substance addiction, or whether it's an addiction to an unhealthy relationship, or laziness, or our own indolence, or whatever it is, this is to me, reliving the story, retelling the story is a way, is done by encouraging our family, our closest friends, to figure out what is your Egypt and what can we do to walk out of it.
Beautiful. Thank you. This is great. This is great. And I think, and you make the helpful point too, Russell, that liberation doesn't happen in one night, right? It doesn't happen over one meal. And it's not necessarily a linear process. And so I want us to move on to the next text, because it's going to lift up another key component of this telling, of this explaining, and what ideally drives the conversation, which we're already kind of experiencing right here. I see Anne Elman. Anne, will you read text 3 in our book?
They pour the second cup?
You got it. So this is from the Mishnah, talking about the Passover ritual. And it's going to both sound familiar and a little different. So pay attention for both.
They pour the second cup for him, the Seder leader, and the child then questions his father. If the child is not knowledgeable, then his father teaches him. Why is this night different from all other nights? On all other nights, we eat both leavened as well as unleavened bread. But on this night, we eat only unleavened bread. On all other nights, we eat all kinds of vegetables. But on this night, we eat bitter herbs. On all other nights, we eat meat that is roasted, stewed, or cooked. But on this night, we eat roasted. On all other nights, we dip once. But on this night, we dip twice. The father must instruct his son according to the son's intelligence. He begins with shame and concludes with praise.
Thank you. So reactions, what sounds familiar, what seems a little different? You know, when you were learning Ma Nishtana Halayla, you didn't realize you were chanting Mishnah, 2,000-year-old Mishnah. So first question is, how many questions are there? What's the punctuation going on this page? Andy.
2, 3, 4.
At least 5.
At least 5, but how many question marks are there?
0 question marks.
1.
Right, there's one. The Manishana Halila Hazeh. Right, and then there's 4 responses. Why is this night different from all other nights? Right, one's about eating matzah. One's about bitter herbs. One is this unusual mention of lamb, the meat being roasted, and then dipping. And what I find fascinating is some Haggadahs frame the 4 responses as 4 questions, right? And so why only matzah? Why maror? And some Haggadahs respond to the big question with 4 responses. So it's 1 question, 4 answers, or sometimes it's 1 question, 4 more questions. And it's not a unified punctuation decision. But what seems to be the goal? Why have this framework of questions and responses, questions and answers? What seems to be the thinking, right? Going back to the original text, why do it this way?
Means something to do with the sun? I mean, the teaching of the sun?
Right, so that first line, right? So you pour a cup of wine, right? This is right at the beginning of the second cup. And then it says, then the child questions his father. But if the child's not knowledgeable, right, presumably to ask questions, to have questions to ask, then the father teaches him to start with this question, Manish Tana, right? So like if you don't have questions of your own, start with, okay, well, why are we doing things different this night? So what seems to be the goal here? Okay, that's not how we start Rosh Hashanah. That's not how we start Purim. We're starting with this kind of structured dialogue. What do you make of it? I learned this tradition, and I don't remember where I learned it, but it's all related, is that we're supposed to put something on the Seder table to encourage people to ask a question of like, wait, why is there a banana on the Seder table? Or like, wait, why are we sitting in different spots? Or what happened to the table? That there's this tradition that like the Seder only begins when someone asks a question. And I think, and ideally, like a question that comes from curiosity, not from a script. And what we have in the Mishnah, though, is saying like, right, we want this to be a dialogue. We want this explanation to not be just a frontal lecture of this is the story, learn it. But of a back and forth question and answer, curiosity, maybe even disagreement. Well, I understood it this way, or I understood it that way. But also knowing that not every child is going to come to the table, overflowing with curiosity. And so if they don't come with their own question, to have this starter question. So what's so different about tonight?
This is Mark Rosenblatt. It feels as if actually these are fairly gratuitous questions. That if there's a purpose, the purpose is to simply engage people, maybe young people. And the irony here is the answers to these questions, which you could probably bridge into the story, are not actually answered in the Haggadah. There are answers about why do you eat Pesach, and there are some other answers, at least in our Haggadah, but they don't relate to these questions per se. So it feels like this is simply a rhetorical device to keep people interested that was inserted in order to allow for the rest of this story to be told.
That's interesting. I hear you. I actually think, and I was reading earlier today, I think we've turned the 4 questions into this script, to this rhetorical script. And actually, most of us often miss the goal that like this is supposed to be the starting point of asking questions and kind of explaining, working through it, making the connections together. But we've gotten so used to printed prayer books and printed Haggadahs that the default becomes, okay, well, we're going to read everything on the page and drink when we're supposed to drink, and we'll do what we're supposed to do. And I think actually what this early text envisioned was that this was supposed to be the beginning of asking and discussing, but not the end, right? Not the end of the conversation, right? So if the Haggadah isn't giving full answers here, it's because there was intended space for us to fill in those together, and for people to have follow-up questions. So in some ways, when I think about our Seders this year and what might be different, I think I'd advise all of us to worry less about how are we sharing all the pages of the Haggadah, right? Being on the same page of the Haggadah, and instead creating space for exploring new questions and hearing different perspectives, and perhaps answering these questions for ourselves this year, right? Why are we eating matzah this year, right? Why is matzah so important this night? What does it mean to be leaning, reclining, right? So the reclining didn't make this original version. There's the mention of roasted meat. And once the temple was destroyed, the Pesach offering, the sacrifice of meat, was less relevant. And so they changed the questions, which I think is also an invitation to us. And maybe Mark, maybe this would be intriguing for you. It's should we be asking new questions, right? Maybe not just this year, but in general, right? What are the questions to guide a conversation of liberation and freedom and leaving Egypt in the 21st century?
No, I would go back and say the point of this is our origin story, and it's what we should learn. And then you can relate it to things in this 21st century.
Right. I wanted to say that.
So what would be the questions that would help?
They're here in the book.
Questions do.
So to stick with those questions, but make sure they get answered.
Well, it's what you said a minute ago about letting these questions come out, and then opening the space in the service or as you go through it to talk about answers of why is it? I mean, I still have no idea why we dip twice. I don't even know what that means. You don't want to dip twice if you've already taken a bite of it, but
double dipping, right?
I mean, what's the purpose of that?
Well, there are two parts in the structure of the Seder where we dip our foods. And I think this year, actually, the metaphor is even more striking, right? So we're dipping our parsley, our signs of spring, in tears, right? So how do we hold the promise of renewal when there's so much loss of life? And we dip later our maror in the charoset, right? The bitterness and the sweetness. And I think this year, right, I think a lot of people are feeling that internally as well, right? How do we hold the horror of this virus, the challenges so many people are facing, the suffering so many people are facing, with some of the sweet things that are emerging, because people are home and spending time with family and connecting over Zoom with people they haven't seen for forever. And what's kind of amazing is that 2,000 years ago, there was that challenge of, right, how do we hold this? How do we hold it in one hand? How do we take it in one bite? And I think that I think the early rabbis and us today are struggling with, right, that's part of being human. It's holding this all in our heart at the same time. I happen to find that we eat to literally internalize these feelings and experiences to be especially profound, right? We don't do that on other holidays. And I think it takes that charge to how do we feel this as if this is happening to us to another level. Any other thoughts, reflections, questions about the 4 questions or 4 responses before we move on? We'll do one more text. Okay. The next text we were going to do, but I think we're going to skip, is about the 4 types of children. And it's really a continuation of the setup of the 4 questions, right? How do you create this as a dialogue? And how do you also kind of recognize that around your table, virtual or real, there are going to be different kind of people engaging with this at different levels, right? And so how do you create different messaging, different experiences for everyone, so we can all take it personally. We can all feel it in our own way. I think I want us to look at the 4 cups. So that's to text 6 from the Jerusalem Talmud. Because you're seeing we have this theme of 4, right? 4 questions, 4 children, 4 cups. And I think that's going to offer us wisdom about how to think about our Seders this year. So I need one more reader. Hi, Geoff Mitelman. You're not going to read. Susan, will you read? Susan Klugman? Maybe she's not here. Hey, Lisa. Lisa, do you feel like reading?
Listening and making dinner at the same time. I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. Oh, Nancy, will you read?
It's Susan. I'm here. Oh, let Nancy read. That's better.
No, Susan, go ahead. Susan, go.
4 cups, Susan.
All right, I'll go. Do you want me to go, Nancy Michaels?
Yeah, please, Nancy Michaels.
Okay.
Why the source of 4 cups of wine?
What is the source for the 4 cups of wine? Rabbi Jacques said in the name of Rabbi Benya that it corresponds to the 4 expressions of redemption. Say to the people of Israel that I am God. I shall free you from the land of Egypt and save you from their oppression. I shall redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. I shall take you as my people. I shall free, save, redeem, and take. Rabbi Joshua, son of Levi, said that it corresponds to the 4 cups of Pharaoh. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. I took the grapes and squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. You shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand. Rabbi Levi said that it corresponds to the 4 kingdoms. The rabbi said that it corresponds to the 4 cups of punishment that God will cause the nations of the world to drink.
Right, so now when someone asks you at your Seder, wait, why do we have 4 cups? You can say, well, there are 4 different reasons. The first one's the most popular, the one that's invoked the most, that God explains in 4 different ways how God is going to redeem the Israelites, take them out of Egypt. The reference to the Joseph story, remember there's a Pharaoh in the Joseph story when Joseph's in the prison, and there's a famous wine bearer in the prison with him, and connecting this to that story, I think also expands how we understand kind of, right, what this origin narrative is, what this collective memory is, right, that the story goes way back. And I think that's like a helpful detail for us right now, right? It's like how we got to this moment isn't just what happened in the scene before, right? Or the beginning of the book of Exodus, but kind of being aware of like all the causes and effects and the interconnections that help us arrive in this moment, in this Egypt, in this challenging place. And there's also another source here that's not in the Talmud, but the idea of the 4 cups, there's a lot of the Passover Seder that's related to Roman symposia, how Romans would hang out and talk philosophy and eat and drink. And so there is this larger cultural influence on our Passover Seder, right? As Jews do throughout all history, there's adaptation and adoption and making it our own. And definitely the format of the Seder is influenced by Roman culture. So I think what I want to offer for all of you with this one is when you're working with a big group over Zoom or FaceTime or however you're going to try to convene, if you're going to convene that way, right? Thinking about, so what's the overarching structure that's clear, that's simple, that helps everyone stay kind of united, even if they're going to be side conversations or some people doing their own things, right? What are the clear pillars that are going to keep you all together? Like, is it your courses? Is it 4 questions that you're going to, right? Questions for today that you're going to intersperse? But as you see, 4 is a big number here. And I want to also offer, if you're having a Seder of 2 or Seder of 1, all of these elements are possible to experience on your own. And I think in some ways, very profoundly. If you're having a Seder on your own task, okay, what's my Egypt? Where am I? And where do I want to go? How do you think about the 4 questions in the dialogue? I don't know about you, but I have a lot of conversations with myself, and the Passover Seder encourages that, right? What's that conversation? What's that question you need to ask yourself or explain? Or who's someone you want to call up and ask a question to? So I actually think kind of the smaller your Seder, the more to lean into all these structures and guidelines, and then be creative with it, personalize it. And like, you never know where it will take you. But I think especially this year, given the challenges and also given the intensity of the overlaps of the story, it's like, how do we let the ritual in and just wash over us and maybe lead us into new places? That's my hope for all of you. I love to do something that I do normally with my Tuesday in the library group. Is on the roadmap, on the handout, I wrote, it says key discovery at the end. And I love everyone. We have 2 minutes, so take 1 minute and think about one thing. Maybe it's a question, maybe it's an idea, maybe it's a text. One thing from tonight, our conversation tonight, that you want to hold on to and bring into your Passover, bring into your Seder. So take a moment for that. And it could be something that you discovered in the conversation of your own mind as you were sitting here hearing us all over Zoom. Wherever the wisdom insight came from is all good. And then I'd love just a couple of people to share, either with voice or on the chat box, something that you're thinking about you're going to bring to your Seder this year. All right, Bob, I'm going to read yours. This year, it should be more about questioning and discussion than following a script that cannot be veered from. Beautiful. Ed writes, why will this night really be different than all other nights? What we are thankful for. And Andy writes that we're not going to skip it just because it's difficult and inconvenient. We're going to go to great efforts to bring everyone together. That's beautiful. I've been thinking about, there wasn't a text about this, but I've been thinking about Dayenu and using that as a way to name gratitude, right? Especially in the face of challenge and adversity and loss. And I've done it at women's Seders before, and I'm thinking about doing it with my family, right? How do we write our own Dayenus, right? What would have been enough? Awesome. And next year in Jerusalem, right? And there are all sorts of ways of thinking about, right, what's the Jerusalem of our future? What is our hope for the next year? So I want to thank you all. I know it's a little different seeing everyone in boxes and being muted and raising electronic hands. And I want to wish you all a meaningful, sweet Passover. I wish you continued health and relief of any suffering that you or your family's going through. And I hope that we can all feel a little, if not a lot, of sense of liberation in the weeks ahead. And someone wrote, we didn't speak of Elijah, and you're talking about the Messiah in the next hour.
I'll be bringing up Elijah a couple times. So
and over, and knowing that sometimes we've got to help Elijah arrive. So on that note, I'm going to thank you all. I'm going to say good night and Chag Sameach and hand you over to Rabbi Mitelman.
thank you, Bethie. I don't know if Rabbi Reeser is still on, but I think there was something that he was going to try to switch me that actually I did not know about Zoom being on the spotlight. So he's going to, I think, trying to shift that, but I'll just start talking.
Yeah, I
while
think you just wanted to make you a co-host.
I am a co-host, so
I think that's all. I think that's all you need.
All right.
The group, it's an awesome group.
I know many of you.
Up. And yeah, Rabbi Reeser says you're all set.
Okay.
And just have fun. And if you see the Messiah, point him towards Larchmont.
I will. And Scarsdale and Harrison and all those wonderful places.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Take it away.
So hi, everybody. Nice to see many of you. Some of you I haven't met, and some of you I've seen in person. But for those of you I haven't met, I'm Rabbi Geoff Mitelman. I live in Harrison. I'm right down the street. And I'm the founding director of an organization called Sinai and Synapses that does work bridging the worlds of religion and science. And I teach at WRT a lot and teach Tuesday nights and trying to figure out all the different ways in which we're trying to make this work. So it sounded like it was a really wonderful conversation with Rabbi Miller just now, and excited to talk with all of you about Yemot HaMashiach, the days of the Messiah. And somebody, and I have to look up to see who had said that, was looks like it was Rick who had said that we didn't speak about Elijah when you were talking about the Passover Seder. And I think that's what the link is from talking about Passover and the Seder to talking about the days of the Messiah. And we're going to talk about the days of the Messiah coming up in a couple of minutes, and the difference between the days of the Messiah and the Messiah itself. But as you may know, it's actually something that we sing right after the meal at the Passover Seder of Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet. Also, it's the same song that's sung at the end of Havdalah, of this idea of Elijah ushering in, some people say the Messiah, some people say the Messianic age. We don't always necessarily think about all of these different kinds of questions. So what we're going to look at today of what we're talking about when we're talking about as a Messiah, what we're going to talk about as the Messianic age. There are a couple things that I want to start with to be able to think about. I noticed that you have your hand, quote unquote, raised. I don't know if that's still raised or not, but I'm going to lower your hand if that's okay.
It is.
Okay. So I want to open this up, and you can virtually raise your hand because I can look and see as somebody raises their hand. But I want to start, when you think about a perfect utopian society, I want to start with, as general as possible, what does a perfect utopian, emblematic, it's the most wonderful thing that you've ever seen, what does that look like to you when you think about a utopia? Or a utopian age or a utopian place. So I'm going to start with that question here, and look to see hands raised to be able to see, even if it's a couple of words. So I'm going to pause here. And there should be a way that you should, if you click on participants, you can click on raise hand, and that allows me to see if you're raising your hand here. Oh, and there's one message here. Israel. Ed had said that. So so Israel, we're going to talk about the specifics in a second. But it doesn't necessarily have to be a Jewish piece. I'm thinking about a most perfect, a perfect way to be able to think about it. And I love seeing everyone in the chat. I want to be able to actually unmute people one at a time. If you quote unquote raise your hand, I can unmute you. Actually, your voice here. So if I can find Mark, you can unraise, or you can virtually raise your hand.
There's no such thing as a utopian society. It doesn't exist.
Well, it does. You're exactly right. Utopia literally means no place. But when you're thinking about an idea of what a perfect society would look like, it can't exist. You're right by definition. But what would it look like as sort of a perfect place that is a wonderful place to be able to be? So Linda said where there was no war or hunger.
I don't know.
If you click on
nations that all follow Westphalian rules.
Go ahead, Mark.
A set of nations that all honestly follow Westphalian rules.
Mm-hmm. The people are able to follow the rules together in a variety of ways. Terrific. Thank you. Maybe one or two other thoughts if they're there. Oh, Rick, is that? Oh, and Ira, okay.
Place of perfect justice, perfect fairness would be a utopia.
So thank you. So a perfect justice and perfect fairness, and I think that's one of the reasons that actually, in many ways, this utopia can't actually really exist, because everyone has different rules, right? That the idea of trying to create a place where there's no war, there's no conflict, on some level, that's actually kind of impossible, because conflict almost by definition is one person wants one thing, another person wants another thing, and it's legitimate to want something there. And so being able to create those kinds of structures and the rules, it sounds like it's a wonderful perspective there of where there's no hunger, there's no war. It's as Ed said, it's sort of asymptotic. It's a goal, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Of talk about as a goal here. So when we think about a perfect utopian society or the Messianic age, it tends to be very universal. I want to pivot that and to think about what does it look like as a Messianic age, and what you think of from a Jewish perspective, a specifically Jewish perspective. So it may be all of these wonderful utopian ideals, but what might be there simply Jewishly, particularly Jewishly? And one person has said Israel. I can't remember who had said that, but there is a piece of the Israel element of this. What are some of the specifically Jewish elements of what the Messianic age might look like?
Do you mean like where God does all our dirty work for us?
Well, that's going to be a question of, does God do all our dirty work, or do we have to do all the dirty work there? That's a question there. What's your question here that you're bringing out about that, though?
Again, no such thing.
That someone once said that there's a great book called "There Is No Messiah and You're It." Right, and we'll talk about this, that some people say that the Messiah might be when the world is so terrible that God needs to come in and do something immediately, or the world is so perfect that we don't need God anymore, and that we won't even know which way it is. I see Ira's hands. I'm going to get him here.
I just don't, that's okay. I don't get how you could have a utopia that's Jewish at all. It doesn't make sense to me, because if you had a utopia, then it would be like John Lennon, right? There would be no religion, there would be nothing. Either everybody would be Jewish or no one would be Jewish, but you couldn't have any distinctions of countries or religions or classes or anything, right? I mean, if it was actually utopia. So I don't know what the Orthodox would believe that the Messiah is. I never really understood what their vision was for when that actually happened. I'd be interested to see how this class develops. Maybe it will, I'll understand it better at the end of it.
So you bring up a really interesting and important point. which is that in some ways, the perfect utopian universal idea is in direct conflict with a particularistic Jewish idea. And Judaism, one of the wonderful things about Judaism is that we can hold two contradictory ideas together. That that's the joke of two people saying you're right and the other person saying you're right, and they said how can they both be right? And said, you know what, you're right, and that's one of the things that happens in Judaism. But yes, that's one of the challenges, and one of the things that's interesting of different movements, the Reform versus Conservative versus Orthodox movements, of where does the balance tip, right? In the Reform movement, the emphasis is much more on the universalistic nature. And as you move farther and farther to the right, and I guess this is the direction that you're seeing here, it tips more and more to the particularistic. And by the way, all of these things are things that we're talking about, looking at it in the year 2020, as the idea of the Messiah, that developed over time. And so we're going to show a little bit of the trajectory of what the Messiah actually looked like here, and what the job was. Okay.
Question: Do the Hasidic who froze their lives in the 1700s, with their behaviors, their clothing, their attitudes, did they freeze that because that was utopia for them?
It may be. I wouldn't say it's utopia for them. They would not necessarily say it's the Messianic age, because they hold to a personal Messiah. I think they feel like it is the best that it could possibly have been. That was sort of the acme. It was the best of what Judaism was at that time, and they froze it there, but it's not where the Messiah is. It's not the Messianic age, if that makes sense. So what I want to do is I want to actually start by going through a couple of biblical texts. And I'm going to share my screen because we're going to look at the way the Messiah, the first sense of the Messiah. And this actually leads to probably the most common question that Jews get asked by fundamentalist Christians or some Christians, which is, why don't Jews accept Jesus as the Messiah? You may have been asked that many, 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 many times of why don't, Jesus was Jewish, why don't Jews accept Jesus as the Messiah? And we're going to unpack this. And at least when I've talked about it with Christians, this explanation, they go, oh, okay, now I get it. This makes sense. So what I want to do, I'm just trying to see, I'm going to call on one person here. Donna, you're sort of in the middle. Can I ask you, I'm going to share my screen. Can I ask you to read a couple things? I'm going to unmute you and read just two verses that I'm going to put on the screen. So I'm going to unmute you if I can. I don't know if I can. I don't know why I'm not able to unmute you. So Donna, I don't know if you're able to. Yep, there you go. All right.
I unmute myself.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and, oops, get to the. You don't need to see my email, but this is from the book of Samuel, starting with chapter 51. So if you'll read 51 and verse 1 here from the book of Samuel.
So at the top there?
Yep, where it says Tower of his victory.
Tower of victory to his king, who deals graciously with his anointed, with David and his offspring evermore. You have to bring it up a little. These are the last words of David, the utterance of David, son of Jesse, the utterance of the man set on high, the anointed of the king, God of Jacob, the favorite of the songs of Israel.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to mute you here. So the Hebrew here, this is where, and if you see this, the word is Mishicho, the Mishicho, which is anointed one. And this is the utterance of the man, the anointed of the God of Jacob, al-Mashiach. So that is the text of what the Mashiach is. Mashiach is a very, very narrowly defined job. The Mashiach literally means anointed. And in biblical times, at second Samuel, David, who was the second king of Israel, he was anointed. A king or a priest is anointed. That's their job. They put oil on them, and they become sanctified to do something very specific. And if you are anointed as a king, your job is to rule, and to rule with justice and create fairness. If you are a priest, your job is to show the religious statutes and follow the religious rules. That is all and the only job that the Messiah is designed to be able to do in biblical times. And so, as you see that David, who deals graciously with his anointed, with David and his offspring evermore. That's why the Messiah is thought to be the descendant of David. Sometimes it's viewed as the son of Jesse, the shoot of Jesse there. So the idea of the Messiah is a very, very narrow job that is very specifically political in nature, power in nature, and potentially religious, but predominantly political and powerful. And so one of the questions that come up when Christians say, why don't Jews accept Jesus as the Messiah? Christians change what the job description is of the Messiah. Because Christians understandably take Jesus to be very, very important. But the most important thing about Jesus in Christian theology is that Jesus was killed. He was crucified. And the Messiah, at least in the Hebrew Bible, is a king, a powerful person. How in the world is a Messiah supposed to get killed and crucified in this kind of way? That just, it didn't make sense to the Jewish conception here. So they had to reinvent what the job of the Messiah was. Oh, the Messiah was going to be the person who saved us from sin. Well, that's not the job of the Messiah in 2 Samuel. The job of the Messiah is to answer prayers. Well, that's not the job description in 2 Samuel. So why don't Jews accept Jesus as the Messiah? Because Jesus didn't do the job that the Messiah is supposed to do, at least as described in the Hebrew Bible. So that is, and generally a lot of Christians go, oh, okay, now I can sort of understand that. But we have, because we live in this Western culture and it's surrounded by Christian thinking, our thinking of what the quote unquote Messiah is has broadened. And we think of the word Messiah, we tend to associate it understandably a lot with Jesus and with Christology. But in fact, the Messiah is a very, very narrow job description at that particular time. So I'm just going to pause here to see if there are questions, or if there are or thoughts, or if anyone has questions or reactions before we go to the next couple of biblical texts. So I'm just going to, if you do have a question, you can unmute yourself.
So, Geoff, you're saying that the definition of Messiah from a Jewish standpoint is not an incarnation of God, but just anointed by God.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. The Messiah is, by definition, a human being. In fact, one of the people who is described as anointed in the Hebrew Bible is King Cyrus of Persia, who's not Jewish, but he is anointed because he is doing a specific job that God had described for him to do a political / religious task forward. So very much not. That's not a Jewish perspective here. Which is also why I don't like the idea of Judeo-Christian, because that conflates there. Yeah, you have another question.
And just follow-up question, was King David the first person that was referred to as being anointed?
I believe so. I believe that is correct. I have to check that, but it is the first one where there is an idea of an anointed piece of that. Although I'd have to look and see if in Leviticus, if the priests might have been anointed in Leviticus. But from a kingship perspective, David is the one who is viewed as from David forever and ever.
So what does the Messiah have to do with I know there's something with Judgment Day, or is that the Christian version?
That's much more of it. So it becomes more of a Christian piece. We'll talk about this in a couple of minutes, because in my mind, everything has to do with politics. Everything has to do with politics. And the description of the end of days ends up changing at the same time. Christianity and rabbinic literature were developing in parallel at the same time. And so there were very similar ideas that were happening. And that started to get written around the time of when the rabbis were coming into existence and Christianity was coming into existence. So that all became around the year 0. They added on what the idea of what the Messiah was going to be. Does that make sense? Other thoughts or questions here before we, yeah.
So what was the job of the anointed one? What was the job of the Messiah, the original one?
So here it is designed to be a king, to be the person who have to have the rightful authority to rule the land. That's what the Messiah was designed to be able to do. Or if you were a priest, to have the rightful religious authority to be able to do something. That's, again, you got there's a lot of play to be able to have, if that's your job description, right? You have a lot of power there, but it is a very, very, very narrow job description. In the same way that we talk about the president, both as an individual human being and the job of the president, or the rabbi. Let's talk to the rabbi. So, right, there is a specific rabbi, or there are a couple of rabbis, and the rabbi has a particular job. The Supreme Court justice has a particular job. The president has a particular job that different people will fill at different times.
Rabbi, I have a sidebar question.
Sure.
Why did we have to wait till we took Melton to learn this? I don't want to be too hypercritical of our Jewish education. However,
yep.
Like, it seemed like this is a pretty interesting thing and relevant, because we do get asked these questions or wonder about these questions that we might have thought to learn them earlier. Thank you.
That's an excellent question. And you know what? I don't know the answer to that. I think some of it is that you all are expressing tremendous interest to ask these questions. And I think you're being very proactive to be able to learn about these kinds of questions. There may be times when you turn to your rabbi on a specific kind of question on specific issues. But I think you're right. I think it's a failing that often happens. I think it's particularly important to be teaching to 11, 12, 13, 14-year-olds. But I think, and it's a complicated, nuanced answer. And there's a lot, I think in Hebrew school, there's a limited amount of time to be able to get information in. But this is, look, it's also a reason why I think a lot of synagogues really encourage kids to be able to continue their learning after becoming bar bat mitzvah, because you learn so much more as an adult. But you're right. I mean, this is the kind of thing that I think it's one of the most common questions that I get asked all the time, and probably for many of you as well. So what I'd love to do is I want to go to a next text that may sound a little bit similar here, or not a little similar here. I would like to get let's see if we can get Nancy. Nancy, can I unmute you here? Able to unmute yourself? Great. And I'm going to have you read the book of Isaiah, starting in chapter 11. Now, this is a couple hundred years after the book of Samuel, but this is describing Isaiah and the description of what's going to happen in the Messianic days. So it's building off of what we were just reading on, but it's a little more fleshed out. And we're going to read a couple of different pieces. So you're going to read just in chapter 11 here, the first few verses here.
But a shoot shall grow out of the stump of Jesse, a twig shall sprout from his stalk. The Spirit of the Lord shall alight upon him, the spirit of wisdom and insight, the spirit of counsel and valor, the spirit of devotion and reverence for the Lord. He shall sense the truth by his reverence for the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes behold, nor decide by what his ears perceive. Thus he shall judge the poor. Oh, sorry.
Yep, keep going.
Thus he shall judge the poor with equity and decide with justice for the lowly of the land. He shall strike down a land with the rod of his mouth and slay the wicked with the breath of his lips.
Keep going. Yep.
Justice shall be the girdle of his loins, and faithfulness the girdle of his waist.
Yep, the wolf.
The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, the leopard lie down with the kid, the calf, the beast of prey, and the fatling together, with a little boy to herd them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together, and the lion, like the ox, shall eat straw. A babe shall play over a viper's hole, and an infant pass his hand over an adder's den. In all of my sacred mount, nothing evil or vile shall be done, for the land shall be filled with devotion to the Lord as water covers the sea.
And then I would like you to read just the first 4 verses of chapter 2 here.
The word that Isaiah, son of Amos, prophesies concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In the days to come, the mount of the Lord's house, shall stand firm above the mountains and tower above the hills, and all the nations shall gaze on it with joy. And the many peoples shall go and say, come, let us go up to the mount of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may instruct us in his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For instruction shall come forth from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem.
So if you can see the Hebrew, Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah, Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah, Udavar Adonai Merushalayim. My singing is terrible, so forgive me for that. And then this last.
Thus he will judge among the nations and arbitrate for the many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not take up sword against nation. They shall never again know war.
All right, thank you. I'm going to stop sharing my my screen here. Thank you very much. So how does this square with some of what we were talking about at the beginning about the relationship of the universalistic nature of what the Messianic age is going to look like and the particularistic elements of this? What are some of the ways in which we see both of those elements here in this text in Isaiah, these 2 texts in Isaiah? Oh, and then we get Diane here. I think Diane, you may have to unmute yourself here.
Okay. So it took me a while to get my brain in gear before when you were asking what utopia would look like.
Mm-hmm.
But 2 elements that I see, one is that there would not be any more war. And the second thing was that there would be no more persecution.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of goes with this. So I don't know. That's all I have to say. I'm done.
Yeah. So you bring up an interesting point here, which is that there's a level of recognizing persecution. That's something that has been historic in Jewish tradition, and certainly for like on Passover, we think about overcoming persecution as the classic joke of they tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. But what's interesting is that the level of the persecution, there is a power that they are supposed to have, that the Messiah is supposed to have, but they are supposed to use it to uphold justice. It's not supposed to get power just for the sake of getting power. They're supposed to be able to use that power to help the needy, to actually prevent war, to be able to bring this peace for the Jewish people and also for the wider world as a whole. So I think that's a really important point here. I'm going to open this up for other thoughts here. Yeah, Linda. Linda, I think you have to unmute. Oh, you're still muted. So hopefully you can figure out, there should be a way towards the bottom. Okay, there you go.
There we go. I had to find my little picture because I only have like 4 up on the top of my screen.
Yeah.
So even the animals are getting along though. So how does that relate to this is we're beating our swords into plowshares. And the animals are, the lion's not eating the lamb, and that's part of it. So nature is in a different kind of ecological harmony, I guess.
Yep. And you bring up and this is something that I think if we were to be all together, we would read this. But if you get your book, if you have your book in front of you, you can flip to this. But if you see that texts 5 and 6, which is Rambam versus Ramban, and actually, what we can do is what I will do is I'm actually gonna I'll have someone read this here. So let me see. Norman, can I unmute you and have you read? You can read text 5 in your book, and you know what I'll do? I'll also share my screen so you can see it. I have it on my computer. So Norman, if you can unmute yourself. Okay, and I'm going to share my screen. And you can see it on text 5 here.
Okay. You can hear me then?
Yep.
Okay, good. Rambam, Leviticus, Vayikra.
So saying for when Israel observes.
When Israel observes the commandments, the land of Israel will be like the world was at its beginning, before the sin of the first man, when no wild beast or creeping thing would kill a man. It is because of this that Scripture says, a babe shall play over a viper's hole, and similarly the cow and the bear shall graze, and the lion, like the
that was just it. Yep.
Like the ox shall eat straw. For dangerous beasts only prey on human beings on account of the sin of man, because of which it was decreed upon him that he be a prey to their teeth, and preying was made a part of their nature, so that they also prey upon each other. Now, at the time of the creation of the world, it is said of the beasts that he gave them the herb for food, as it is written, and to all the animals on land, all the birds in the sky, and everything that creeps on the earth, in which there is the breath of life, I give all the green plants for food. Meaning that such was the nature with which they were endowed forever. It was only afterwards that they learned how to pray on account of human sin. But the beasts of the land of Israel, when man will be in a state of perfection, will cease from their harmful ways and revert to their original state of nature, with which they were endowed at the time of creation. This sounds like the Garden of Eden before the fall.
That's exactly right, and that's exactly what they're talking about.
Yeah.
That at the beginning in Genesis 1, everything's vegetarian.
Yes.
All right, and so the way that Ramban talks about it is that it is a totally and completely, nature is totally upended. It is a totally different world than what we would expect. And so you're exactly right. So that's the way that one thinker talks about the way that the Messianic age is going to be qualitatively different. It's going to be a difference of degree and not kind in the Messianic age, according to Ramban. What's interesting is that Rambam, Maimonides, says something totally and completely different. So I'm going to, Alan, can I get you to read starting in text 6?
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, you can hear me.
Mm-hmm.
Rambam, Mishnah Torah, Laws of Kings, 12:1-2.
So starting with let no one think.
Let no one think that in the days of the Messiah, any of the laws of nature will be set aside, or any innovation be introduced into creation. The world will follow its normal course. The words of Isaiah And the wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, is a parable and a riddle, meaning that Israel will live securely among the wicked of the Gentiles, who are likened to wolves and leopards. They will accept the true religion and will neither plunder nor destroy. Instead, they will eat what is permitted at ease, like Israel, as it states, the lion will eat straw like an ox. Our sages taught there will be no difference between the current age and the days of the Messiah, except in the matter of the subjugation to foreign kingdoms. The simple interpretation of the prophet's words appear to imply that the war of Gog and Magog will take place at the beginning of the days of the Messiah. Before the war of Gog and Magog, a prophet will arise to cause Israel to be upright and to prepare their hearts, as it states, behold, I am sending you Elijah.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
I'm going to stop.
What is Mog and
Magog? I am going to explain that right this moment. So, first of all, if you notice that Rambam, who is a very rational person, he's very into science and medicine, says, wait a minute. This is not going to be a totally new, weird space. This is a metaphor. We have to read it metaphorically here, which is in total contrast, total opposition to Ramban. So when we're thinking about all these ways in which these are contradictory ways of thinking, and Judaism can really hold these two contradictory ways, and you can in many ways choose whichever direction resonates most with you here. But this leads actually to the question, I can't remember who had asked this about the coming of days and linking with the way Christianity thinks and actually rabbinic literature of the world to come and the resurrection of the dead. That's something that comes up a little bit later in Judaism as well. So Gog and Magog were viewed as great enemies of Israel. And if you think about a lot of wonderful literature, and this happens in Judaism and in Christianity, of how wonderful the world is going to be. What's going to happen right beforehand? It's going to be awful, right? There's going to be a horrible wars and disease, and it's going to be so bad, so that when the world to come has arrived, the Messianic age has come, we survived it. Look at how wonderful this is after all the turmoil that happens. And we hear a lot of this language. There's a lot of apocalyptic language that we think about oh my God, are we going through the end times right now? Look at how horrible our world is right now. It must mean that the Messiah is about to come. And people have been saying that for 2,000 years, 2,500 years, of look how horrible this world is. The Messiah is going to come here. And so now in around the year, starting around the year 0, in Israel, things were really bad. The Romans were in charge, and they were oppressing the Jewish people, and they ended up destroying the Second Temple. And so that was natural that a lot of the Messianic ideas and the Messianic ideals arose out of that sort of cauldron. That, oh, Gog and Magog, well, that's the Romans, and they're the ones, they're destroying us right now. Clearly, the Messiah is going to come. Jesus, as an apocalyptic prophet, he thought the kingdom of God was coming, any day. And so a lot of what comes up in the New Testament is a change to be able to say, wait a second, we've got to rethink this, because any day. Oh, wait, now it's been 300 years. Clearly, there's a little problem going on. Judaism also had to deal with that question of it's coming. Judaism, in a lot of ways, downplayed the role of power. because what they discovered is that if there were Jews that were coming and they were going to try to get more power to try to defeat the Roman army, and that happened in the year 70, and particularly it happened in the year 135. There was a guy named Bar Kokhba who led a huge rebellion against Rome, and that led to the massacre of rabbis, just left and right. The rabbis started to say, you know what, maybe having this political power, not all what it's cracked up to be. And so Judaism really downplayed the role of an individual who was going to take a political power, because if you have political power and you fight against Rome, Rome is going to come down on you like a hammer. And so the rabbis really downplay the political element, and they lift up the more religious and sort of spiritual elements here. So I'm going to pause before we look at a rabbinic text on this for questions or reactions here. Yeah, I see Diane.
Yeah, I have a contrast between what Ramban says and Rambam, because Ramban basically says, you know what, when the Jews start doing what they're supposed to do, then we're going to have this wonderful thing. It's going to be great. When Israel observes the commandments, and before they, and then when they do everything, they follow all the rules and they're so good, then we're going to have the Messiah. And the Messiah, it seems to me, he doesn't really mention a Messiah. He just says, things are going to be great. It's going to be like the Garden of Eden. Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, this is kind of feeds right into, gee, we must have done something wrong. That's why we had a Holocaust.
Right, and that becomes that it's easy to have that theology. I find that theology a little bit problematic, right? To be able to say, and as people are even thinking now of COVID-19 as a punishment from God. Some people are that more conservative theology, and that you can create that, right? So there's a messianic fervor can really harm what we need to be doing here and now, and that's how we're going to end. When we're going to talk about how we deal with sort of messianic fervor. I'm going to see Alan's hand. So Alan, I think you have to unmute yourself. Oh, let me get Mark, and then Alan, you'll unmute yourself here. Yeah.
Yeah. So Rambam lived, I think, underneath a Muslim rule. Mm-hmm. And it's possible that Mag and Gog, or whatever it is, were basically metaphors, because yes. What he's really saying, and this goes back to something you said at the beginning about everything's really political, is they lived as under dimitude. They were dhimmis, they had to pay a tax, and were really second-class citizens in the society. Mm-hmm. And partly you can read this as saying, we'd like to be equal. Mm-hmm. And something will come about that will make us no longer be dhimmis in Muslim lands.
Mm-hmm. I think that's accurate. I think it's also, it's not as strident as I think other languages, because overall the Muslims at that time were fairly tolerant of Jews and Christians there. He was in a much better place than medieval France during the Crusades, right? There
were still second-class citizens that had to pay a tax for living, different from everybody else.
Absolutely. I think there's a difference, though, of having to pay taxes versus we are going to rebel, we are going to get massacred, right? There's a different valence there. But you're right. I think there's a piece of frustration that there's always an undercurrent in Jewish thinking, because Jews have historically not had a lot of power, and Maimonides definitely dealt with that. I want to get Alan, and then I want to look at another text here.
So how do we deal with the fact that the current state of Israel is much more aggressive and willing to fight for what they feel is correct, as opposed to this rabbinical text?
Yeah, so we'll get to that. Let me get to the piece, because Israel is both an outgrowth of a longing for Jewish sovereignty for 2,500 years, and also out of 19th century nationalism. And so we're going to talk about the 19th century in a couple minutes. What I want to do is I want to actually, I think I will, actually, you know what? Let me unmute Andy. I'm going to unmute you here, if that's okay. I would like you to read. I'm going to share my screen. This is a wonderful classic text of that is from the Babylonian Talmud, which is a collection of texts here that you may have heard, but I think it's just a wonderful text of of how the job of the Messiah has changed in rabbinic literature. Not necessarily the powerful person here, but reading here with Rabbi Joshua, son of Levi.
Okay, Babylonian Talmud. Rabbi Joshua, son of Levi, met Elijah standing by the entrance of Rabbi Simeon, son of Yochai's cave. He asked him, "Will I make it to the world to come?" He replied, "If the master desires it." He then asks him, "When will the Messiah come?" "Go and ask him himself," was his reply. "Where is he sitting?" "At the entrance to the city." "And by what sign may I recognize him?" "He's sitting among the poor lepers. All of them first undo all of their bandages and then rebandage all of them, whereas he unties and rebandages each separately, saying, 'Should I be needed, I will not be delayed.' So he went to him and said to him, 'Peace upon you, my master and teacher.' 'Peace upon you, son of Levi,' he replied. 'When will you come, master?' he asked. 'Today,' was his answer. On his returning to Elijah, the latter inquired, 'What did he say to you?' 'Peace upon you, son of Levi,' he answered.
Yep, they're up on.
Whoop, lost you there. There we go. Thereupon he, Elijah, observed, 'He thereby assured you and your father of a portion in the world to come. He spoke falsely to me,' he rejoined, stating that he would come today, but he has not. He, Elijah, answered him, 'This is what he said to you today, if you will heed his voice.'"
Thank you. So it's a very, very rich text. There's some wonderful commentaries on it, but this is one thing that the rabbis like to do is they'll take one little snippet of a verse and they use the rest of it to be able to do a teaching. So in the book of Psalms, it says, "Today, if you hear my voice, I will redeem you," in this way. Almost like when you do the 4 children at your Seder, of what does this festival mean to you, because the word "to you" is in there. But this idea of the Messiah here really changed the job. The Messiah is sitting not on the throne of David, not as an anointed priest, but sitting at the entrance of the city, not even in the city, but the lepers, the people who are ostracized and sick, and blends in. If you think about who's in the city, everyone in the city, you walk through and everybody is totally anonymous there. And so the Messiah blends in this kind of way. And how do we know who the Messiah is? Somebody who is there empathizing with those who are the least powerful, those who need the most. And whereas the only way that you can know this is everyone else is doing their bandages, they take them all off and they're all sores, and then they rebandage all of them. The Messiah does this one and then rebandages and this one. And so it's a very, very subtle sign that needs to happen. And the Messiah that God willing may come at any moment, and to be ready to be able to go. And so it's not that the Messiah is going to come today, but the question is that the Messiah will come only when we are able to follow God's voice. And linking to actually what we talked about earlier of this tension between the universalistic and the particularistic ways of what the Messianic age is going to look like. There's a phrase that I'm sure many of you know, which is the Jews are thought to be a light unto the nations. to be able to be an example of what does it mean to live justly and kindly and fairly. And so that is the element of when you have power, and there's a lot of research that actually suggests this, that the more power you end up getting, the less empathy you're able to show to somebody beneath you. And there's a great book called The Power Paradox by a guy named Dacher Keltner. And so being able to still hold that power and yet empathize is a really, really hard tension, in the same way that we've got to hold that tension of being able to be rooted in what does it mean to be Jewish, to hold on to our Torah, to be centered in a specific location, but then at the same time to be able to say, this inspires to other people as well. And so we have a couple minutes here, so I want to just end with a, I'm not going to read all of this text here, but I want to come to a question that Alan had brought up, which was how and why Israel comes in. And actually, you may have thought that, you may have seen some of these ultra Orthodox Jews. There's a sect of Orthodox Jews who boycott the Israel Day parade, because there are some who say Israel was only supposed to come into existence when the Messiah comes. It is a heresy to be able to bring a Jewish state without the Messiah here. But what happened was that in the 19th century, Enlightenment thinking started to be able to come into existence. And we know a lot of what the Enlightenment thinking talked about. But the biggest pieces that came out from Enlightenment thinking were two key elements, which were democracy and science. Those are really the biggest outgrowths. And by the way, America is viewed to be an experiment in democracy. And so one of the wonderful things about democracy is that the power gets distributed. It is not a king who rules over everybody, but democracy was able to say, wait a second, individuals are going to have a say in who is going to have that power. What is the power going to look like? That's why the American system of government divides its power into three different branches. And democracy started to spring up in the 17, 18, 1900s. And so the reform movement, which is very much an outgrowth of Enlightenment thinking, said, wait a second, we don't need a Messiah to be able to come into existence. We need to be able to use our democratic means to be able to wield the power that we need and to be able to create more justice. There is a pretty clear link that the more democratic a country is going to be, the more just it's going to be. It's not perfect for sure, but there's a stronger link. You think about the U.S. versus North Korea. You can understand that there's a link there. That there's the more democratic a country is, the more it's going to be able to take care of its least powerful people, its most vulnerable population. The scientific element of, wait a second, there's no way that the lion's gonna eat the straw and the universe is gonna get turned upside down. Like that's Narishkeit. There's no way that works scientifically. But I am able to buy into this idea of let's make the world a better place. Let's usher in this world of justice and peace. That's something that's scientific that's able to come in. So the reform movement, which really celebrated Enlightenment thinking, shifted from the idea of a Messiah to the Messianic age, which is a little bit more amorphous, a little more, as someone said here, asymptotic here. And so I saw there was a question of, do Reform Jews place that much emphasis on the Messiah? And the answer is that we don't place much emphasis on the Messiah, but we do talk about l'taken ha'olam, to repair the world. And the ending there's b'malchut Shaddai, underneath the kingdom of God, or the rule of God. And so the idea of the Messiah has really changed and shifted. And so you can also understand, by the way, why liberal Reform Jews talking with Christians about the Messiah, it is a total and complete disconnect at this point, right? Because as Reform Jews, we've totally downplayed what a Messiah is going to be. And the Messiah that we may not even be as consciously aware of is a very specific job that someone's supposed to do. And Christians have a totally different definition of what the Messiah is supposed to do and what the job is going to be. But we are able to come together and say, like, okay, how do we create this world of justice here? But the idea of what the Messiah has been has changed in a lot of ways. So there are a couple of last comments that I want to say to end, but I want to give people a chance for last thoughts or questions here, or niggling thoughts. So I want to end with a really interesting distinction that comes up. There's a prayer, and it's text. If you have it in front of your books, you can see it. It's text 10 that became an adaptation of Maimonides' Principles of Faith, and it's sung not as much in the Reform movement as very much in the conservative movement of Anima Amin. It was also sung by Holocaust survivors as people were actually going into the gas chambers. This was something that was sung by a lot of people during the Holocaust, during the Shoah. And it says, it translates, I believe with perfect faith in the Messiah's coming, and even if he be delayed, I will await him. And I think there's a really important distinction that comes up, because it doesn't say, I believe with perfect faith in the Messiah, even if he's delayed. It's, I believe in perfect faith in the Messiah's coming. I believe, as someone said, it's asymptotic, right? I believe that the world is and can be better today than it was yesterday. I believe with perfect faith that I can actually help hasten this world that we are trying to be able to create. I believe with perfect faith that I have power, which is why I love the title of this book that I mentioned before. There is no Messiah, and you're it, right? There is not an individual Messiah. At least most of us as Reformed Jews don't buy into that methodology. They don't buy into that idea. But I can believe that we can be part of this movement to be able to help usher in this world of justice and peace. And to recognize that the job of the Messiah has changed over time, but that we can be able to create a more Messianic age, a more Messianic era here. So Norman, I see you have your hand raised. Yes.
It's just one thing, Geoff. Isn't part of the Messianic age that the whole world, the Gentile world, will give up whatever their beliefs are, become Jews or believe in the God of Israel? And that would be the perfect world. Violence would disappear.
So sort of is the right. So in Christianity, the ideal world is everybody accept Jesus Christ as their personal Lord and Savior. Mm-hmm. That's actually not what Judaism teaches. Judaism, with it, emphasizes what's called the world to come, and they actually talk about two different ways that you can be part of you can get into the world to come. One is if you're Jewish, right? That's if you're Jewish, great. But if you follow what are called the Noahide laws, the laws of Noah, because Noah was not an Israelite. Noah came before Abraham. And if you follow the Noahide laws, then you also get a share in the world to come if you are not Jewish. And the Noahide laws are: don't eat the flesh of a living animal, don't lie, don't steal, don't murder, uphold courts of justice. I think don't deny God. Then you get a share in the world to come. The idea of what Judaism is designed to be able to do, it's not a perfect world. Is not everybody being Jewish. God forbid everyone should be Jewish, right? This is the synagogue I don't go to. Is what would happen there. But if people are able to say, I am showing how living my Jewish life can be an example for others, that is what ushers in the Messianic era. That is what it means to be a light unto the nations.
They would be Torah observant, if not.
They would be, I would say, I don't know if they would necessarily be Torah observant. If you're Jewish, yes, you're Torah observant. But if you are not Jewish, it's being able to uphold very universal laws of justice.
Mhm.
If you Google Noahide laws, you'll see what those are.
Yes, thank you.
So my wish for all of you on this very strange stretch that we're going through right now is to be able to hold the pride of being able to hold your Seder wherever and however you're going to do it. Recognize it's going to be weird, but it is something that is going to be a powerful statement to be able to say, this is something that I can be doing here, and to be able to say, what can I then do for others? How can my Seder help usher in a little bit more of the Messianic era to be able to create this world, as Nancy just wrote, this wonderful way of justice and peace and loving kindness. Jewish living is a way to be able to express that. And so I want to wish all of you a Chag Sameach, a Zis Pesach, a joyous Passover. To have health and safety and sanity, which has been challenging, I know, for all of us. And most of all, a sense of connection and community here. So thank you all for taking some time to do some learning here this evening.
Thank you. Wishing everyone the same.
Thank you, Rabbi.
And stay well.
Thank you. I'm going to try to, if I can, hopefully everyone's unmuted now, hopefully, or at least I've unmuted everyone, so you can wish each other Chag Sameach and a good Passover.
Thank
Chag
you.
Sameach.
Stay safe.
Bye-bye. Be safe, healthy.
You too.
Bye.
Oh, look at the kitty.
Here he is.
Oh,
He's a sweetie. Have a good holiday.
you too.
Still be on the computer.